At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too.
Well, welcome everybody. We're really privileged and honored today to have Dr. Lloyd with us to talk about James Madison and the First Amendment, and particularly to walk us through a website that is going to be useful, I think, not only for our class, but sort of for broader audiences to understand Madison's role in the drafting and ratification of the amendments and working through Congress, specific wording and all the struggles, arguments, compromises that went into that are so wonderfully illustrated in this website. So I've asked Dr. Lloyd to come and speak about that today with us and talk a little bit about it, and then let's have a Q&A and kind of a conversation and seminar with him as we go. Join me in welcoming Dr. Lloyd.
And I also want to introduce Sean Whitney, a graduate of School of Public Policy, who's going to help us. He's going to stand up there, and I'm going to make a fool of myself walking around. But if there's anything that goes wrong, he can take the blame. Okay? Now, I think what we should do is to begin where we're going to end, and end where we're going to begin, which means the actual text of the First Amendment, which is what we're looking at. We can look at the entire 10 amendments, which is the Bill of Rights. But I think since this class is focusing on the First Amendment, but then one part of the First Amendment, let's just take a very, very quick look at what the relevant portion of the First Amendment is. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting, 1, an establishment of religion, or 2, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then it goes on to talk about freedom of speech in the press and the right of people to assemble and to petition. So the purpose of today is not to examine how the courts and other people have interpreted that phrase, but rather to work the other way around. How did that phrase come into being itself in the first place? Which is not... You didn't turn off your...
I just turned it off.
Yes, good for you. Good for you. Note, people, that was the operator's problem. You're going to excite, going to cut that? Yeah. Now you're embarrassed, aren't you? Yeah, a little bit, right. Okay, so what we want to do is to work the other way. How did that phrase come into being? Why are, if we can answer it, speech and press linked to it? Why peaceably assemble and petition linked to it? Why those 6 together? And why that language? Because this is not simply an exercise in excavation. It is that we look by, here's a theme that Sean will know very well. My approach is I go back to come back. And as you go back to gather information, to gather insights, to gather angles, that when you come back to the current world, and you're arguing with people or discussing with people, you can have a deeper, richer contribution to make to the argument. And I'll just give you one, maybe 2 first, just to tickle as we go through. And I've heard it said very often that the framers thought that freedom of religion, however stated, was the most important right of all, and that's why they put it first. And I think that it would be very wise just to take a look at that. It turns out that that's not correct, but that doesn't mean to say that the freedom of religion isn't important. It just means it helps you from falling into silly traps and making silly arguments that you don't need to make if you're a bit more thorough. Another one is, why is the Second Amendment right behind the first? Of course, 2 has to follow 1. But why wasn't the 4th behind the first? Why wasn't the 9th behind the first? And is there a link? Just as a proposition for us to think about, is there a link between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment? And what might that link be? Okay, so I just thrown out two, what we'll call tickles, to think, tickle your fancy, to think about that. And, I'll give you a third one, because I'm a prof. And that is, why is the Bill of Rights, I say is, why is the Bill of Rights, or the Declaration of Rights, at the end? If we take a look at state constitutions, they're either in the beginning, as a preface, or in the document itself. Why is it that this comes at the end? And that, it seems to me, is an interesting question. It may not lead us to any profound breakthroughs, but at least it, again, tickles the fancy, and I hope makes us curious and enriches our or not. It may not be a wow, but it might be a Okay, so I'll give you three, but there are more, and hopefully you can find some along the way. Let's start our journey. Okay, I have slightly rehearsed it with Sean, but not deeply, because I think a conversation of this kind of thing is an unrehearsed journey. And I don't know exactly where it's going to go, although I have those three things in mind. We're going to look at the origin, which means you're going to look at by origin, there are two parts to look at. One is a history. How do things, where do they come from? Origin. And are there certain documents that we can turn to at certain periods of time? Say, aha, look at. And when you think of origins, you also think of philosophy. Who came up with an idea? So there's history, which provides a sort of an unfolding, and a document, and then an idea. When we think of politics, we can think of the principle of, say, prudence, which is not in high operation these days. And linked to prudence is deliberation, and linked to deliberation is compromise. And a lot of this story that we're going to look at, the politics of this story, is the politics of compromise, properly understood as sort of the art of compromise. The art of compromise is not, let's make a deal. The word compromise can be broken down into two parts, com and promise. Com is with, but promise now becomes promise. It's the same spelling, different pronunciation. So with promise, that is a handshake, an agreement, a settling, not necessarily a solving, but a settling. So the art of compromise is extremely important in the art of politics. But of course, there's going to be grubby stuff. Today, we only practically see grubby stuff. And I'm very, very suspect of people who try to rise above the grub and do something decent. So the politics involves the art of compromise, shall we say, properly understood, and backroom grubby. And that's going to be found particularly from the historian's pen. All right. Let us begin with that framework: origin, history, philosophy, politics, compromise, grub. Okay. Let us begin by just going to Google, the origin and politics of the Bill of Rights. Somebody wants to just click that in, and you will see that there are 36 million. About 10 minutes ago there was 76. This afternoon there was 135. Wow. So I don't know how it shifts like the stock market, right? I have no idea how it does that. But if you take a look, the origin of the teaching American history is number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. I'm not really known for this. I'm known for the Constitutional Convention. Right. But somehow this Bill of Rights captures the imagination of students, of teachers, of somebody, and I don't understand the Google numerical system, but I'm going to accept it. Because I like the outcome for the moment until it keeps dipping, and then I'm out of it. But if we just click on that first one, it comes up, the origins and politics of the Bill of Rights. So a summary, it's an interactive. It's supposed to be a wow. And so, for example, So just give an example. If we go to the rights of conscience, what is here is the Bill of Rights on top. So if we just go to the rights of conscience, and we, the scale here is such that we might have to do it. But you can see, where would we find in all the documents that exist, where would we find the rights of conscience? You will not find it in Magna Carta. You will not find it in the English Petition of Rights. You will find it in Charter of Rhode Island. You will find it in the state constitutions. You will find it when you get to ratification. So there is a quantitative question here. Quantity doesn't tell us everything, but there's a quantitative issue that somehow the subject matter that you are looking at, the right of conscience and the establishment of religion, how far back do you go historically or philosophically? Not the Magna Carta. It starts somewhere else, and it is developed somewhere else. So where else? So I'm just giving you that because it provides you with a very, very good summary and you can play with it. I'm not going to spend all the time doing that, but as Jeff said, this is an introduction to the site and an encouragement. Okay, now, if we were to go back and say that we're going to take a look at the documentary origins. You take a look at the documentary origins. So let's take a look at the English and colonial roots. So we've got history and philosophy. There's English and colonial roots are often mentioned. So if we go down and we see here's a chart. And here's the Bill of Rights, the content of the Bill of Rights. If you were to take a look at a Bill of Rights, which we started off with, there are actually 26 rights in the Bill of Rights. Although there are 10 amendments, there are 26 rights in there. 6 of which are in the First Amendment, 2 of which deal with religion. That's just quantitative. We're not talking about qualitative at the moment, we're just talking quantitative. And if we were to take a look, 9 of the 26 come from Magna Carta. And it seems to me that raises a curious question. I have been to many museums, including the National Archives, in which you often see a picture or a painting or a replication of the Magna Carta next to the Bill of Rights. There are many such renditions. In fact, there is a plaque at Runnymede in England where the Magna Carta was signed in 1215, and there is a plaque there. And it says on this spot, Magna Carta, and it's donated by the American Bar Association. The British don't seem to pay much attention to, but we do. Well, since we do, it must matter. We're moving from quantity now to quality. What is it that matters about Magna Carta, not just to lawyers, but to citizens? Magna Carta represents something, even though quantitatively it's only 9 out of the 26. I say only because there are others, documents, in which the 26 receive greater representation numerically. Well, I'll tell you what is important about Magna Carta, as Sean is emphasizing: due process of law, takings, just compensation, no excessive bails and fines, no cruel and unusual punishment, speedy trials, what we might common law, impartial jury. In other words, a great part of American law on the rule of law depends upon, broadly stated, due process. And without due process, the rule of law, which is the qualitative question, would be in greater difficulty. So Magna Carta is important, not just for lawyers, but for those of us who appreciate the rule of law. However, there's something else that's going on in the British tradition, and that is, it seems to have an absence. There are 3 documents for the British tradition: Magna Carta, 1215, English Bill of Rights, Petition of Rights against the King, 1628, and the English Bill of Rights, 1689, which has often been said to be the model for America. One of the things you will notice that is absent in Magna Carta, English petition, and English Bill of Rights says there is no reference to establishment of religion or conscience. So if we were to talk about religion, establishment of religion and conscience, we have to look somewhere else for the origin or the idea or the establishment or the germ. Now, I know that we could go back and back and back and back. We've got to start somewhere, right? We've got to start at 3:30. We've got to end sometime. We've got to end at 4:30. So every story we tell might have an arbitrary beginning and an arbitrary end, but we have to do it. All right, so we've got to, maybe you could go further back than 12:15. You could go back and say, thou shalt not steal. Right? All right, so I'm starting at 12:15. Okay. But notice then that but there's an absence of a concern with, well, the religious question. The religious question may be tied up with the political question, but it is not explicitly stated. If I were to look at the document and say, for example, Sean, if you were to press on that, click it just there, just press on it. What happens is the Magna Carta comes out. So those red dots in there will give you the document. So that if you wanted to study further, you could look at the document. Okay, just to show you what is also more possible. Okay. Yeah, I know what I'm going to do. Now, if we were to take a look at the English Bill of Rights of 1689, I have not put in rights of conscience and free exercise, but you will see something here which I find fascinating. In the English Bill of Rights, you will find the right to keep and bear arms. There are two predecessors, and one has to say, well, yeah, you're right, they're there, and you could read them. I mean, all you have to do is to press this button, press this button. One of the things Sean and I might do is instead of pressing the button and the entire document come up, is to be able to press the button and that particular section comes up. But that takes a while. Right, Sean? Absolutely. Right. So the English Bill of Rights of 1689 does have the right to keep and bear arms. And it says bluntly, Protestants shall have the right to keep and bear arms. So here is a link between religion and arms. And one might very well ask, why is that link? And the answer is because the English Bill of Rights is fighting a Catholic monarchy. And all the better, my dear, to secure a non-Catholic monarchy, a Protestant succession, Protestants will be able to defend themselves. And that is one of the first times that I have noticed a link between the right to bear arms and the right to conscience or some form of religion. I don't want to overdo it, but it seems to me a curious issue, that it is not born in the right to go hunting and shooting a partridge in a pear tree. It is, in fact, linked to protecting a group of people from the unlawful or unregulated misuse of power by those who are in power. Okay. Then we could talk more about it. Yeah, right. Some interesting things come about as a result of this. All right, let's go now to the next phase. We've in effect done a 20-minute coverage of the origins, the history and the philosophy. And we've raised a couple of interesting points, namely Magna Carta with its lack of conscience, the state constitutions with, and where does this right to bear arms fit into the whole, to the whole mix. So let's take a look now at politics of the Bill of Rights, which I've said can then deal with prudence, they can deal with grub. The Constitution has to be ratified, and overwhelmingly, the ratifying conventions argued that there ought to be a Bill of Rights, since the Constitution itself lacked an explicit Bill of Rights. Hamilton's point was the Constitution is a Bill of Rights. And how could he argue that? Well, because in Article 1, Section 9, there's a listing of the right to habeas corpus. There's a right to no bill of attainder. There's right to what is it? No ex post facto law. So there are rights. Moreover, creating a republic is done by the right of the people or the consent of the people. So we do not need a Bill of Rights. At that particular time, during the Federalist Papers, Madison agreed with him. Who is it that introduces the Bill of Rights in the first Congress? James Madison. So this raises a very important political question. Is this grub politics? Did Madison just simply change his mind and he didn't care? He just put his finger up which way is the wind blowing? Or is there a principle involved in Madison's apparent change of mind? And it is true that in the ratification debates there was this position of a Bill of Rights. And what Madison did was to sort out those rights which had become traditionally American through the colonial and English heritage and through the state constitutions which had been created, and distinguish those from amendments to the Constitution which antagonistic delegates to the ratifying conventions proposed. So you've got two kinds of opponents. Those who think the Constitution should be restrained more by a Bill of Rights, and those who think that the Constitution has within itself the seeds of massive destruction of American life, that we ought to return to the Articles. And so the task, as George Washington says in his first inaugural, is it possible to retain all the work that we have done in creating a more perfect union and at the same time satisfy the concern which Americans have that the government may exceed its powers from time to time? Now that's different than saying the only way to do that is by going back to the Articles, which apparently even today a number of people would like to see happen. So if Madison is changing his mind because of what's going on in the wind, or changes his mind because of prudence, I think one has to come to grips with that question. Is it possible, or is it just an invention, to keep what is strong and satisfy the concerns that people have that the strength may become too strong? And Madison listened during the ratifying conventions, and he listened to, particularly in exchanges with Jefferson, about that issue, while still retaining his number one problem that Madison had. The problem, the main vice with the Articles of Confederation was that the states were too strong and that the Union was too weak. So Madison has to, if he gives up that basic point, then I would say he's acting in an unprincipled fashion. Does he retain that basic point? We shall see. Okay, so let's turn then to the politics of the Bill of Rights. I think it's number 2. The politics of the Bill of Rights. Now, this is a very complicated site, but it is very, very thorough. And as long as you keep the distinction between origins, which deal with history and philosophy, and politics, which deal with prudence and grub, then I think you'll be all right. Because both are at work in the Bill of Rights. So, the ratification controversy is over, the government gets started, and the first Congress begins. Anticipating the Bill of Rights in the first Congress is Washington's statement. Debates in the first Congress. If we go to the debates in the first Congress, there's 5 dimensions, and this could be, I think you could write a paper or do some further graduate work on all of this. If we go down, you'll see dimension 1 is Madison's speech. That's his famous June the 8th speech, in which he makes the argument for a Bill of Rights. People are saying, but is this the same Madison who just 2 years ago sided with Hamilton and said we don't need a Bill of Rights? It's remarkable. Jefferson has an impact on Madison. But I would also add the fact that the Constitution is ratified has an impact on Madison. Now we can talk, because the main object of those, shall we say, extreme opposers was, let's have a second convention. And Madison said, under no way, one miracle is enough. So Madison proposes amendments to the Constitution. He makes 9 huge proposals. Where did he want them? Well, what I've done is to try to show you. If you look at Madison's proposals here, incorporated into the Constitution, and go down, where does he start? He starts by saying, let's add the Declaration of Independence to the preamble. So we make it a comprehensive, inclusive preamble to the Constitution. And then he goes and he says, well, what comes after the preamble? Article 1. Where in Article 1 would I like to stop? And he says, I'd like to stop at Article 1, Section 2, which deals with representation. The reasonable anti-federalist said that 1 for 40,000 is inadequate representation. Let's change to 1 to 30,000. So Madison says, you got a point. Let's introduce that. Because the anti-federalists, the opposition would say, you never know, by 2018 it may be 1 for 600,000. And what kind of representation is that for a representative government? Which is, I think, a very profound question. Give the anti-federalists, the opposition, enough time and they'll come true. So that's what Madison does. What does Madison do? He's opening up this original Constitution. He's saying, let's change this. So if we go down, we see Section 3, no changes. Why? Because that deals with the Senate, and 1 state, 1 vote. There's no need to change that. Representation is not the issue. We go down, Article 5, Section 5, no changes. Article 6, no changes. Third proposal. Compensation. The opposition said, you know, it's a bit messy, a bit nasty, that in the Constitution the executive's pay can be controlled, the judge's pay can be controlled, but Congress's pay can't be controlled. That sounds like corruption. So Madison says, you know what, you have a point. So let's introduce that Congress cannot have their pay increased until such time as they've had an election. Well, that ultimately, as we know, gets defeated, but comes back to be an amendment. The final amendment, which is adopted, and that was about 20 years ago. And if you take a look at it, it's exactly what is here. Right? So we go down. And we stop here for a moment at Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is where the powers of Congress are laid out. There are 18 powers, including General Welfare Clause, Interstate Commerce Clause, the Taxation Clause, many clauses dealing with war and military, and also a clause at the end saying that Congress shall have power which is necessary and proper for putting into effect the aforementioned powers. For those people who are concerned about a runaway power of Congress and the federal government, Article 1, Section 8 is the main concern. And so it is at this point, Article 1, the original Article 1, Section 9 restrains. That's where you'll find habeas corpus. That's where you find ex post facto Article 1, Section 9, which restrains Congress. So, what happens? In Article 1, Section 9, between clauses 3 and 4, Madison says, let's insert the following. First, the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship. That, in a way, means free exercise. I am free to exercise my religion and not be punished in a civil service job. Second, nor shall any national religion be established. Third, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or in any pretext infringed. Four, the people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak, to write or publish, and the freedom of the press as well as shall be inviolable. The people shall not be restrained from peaceably assemble and consulting with the common good. These are all separate ones. And the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free state. Now, I have to raise the question, is this an individual right to hunt and fish, or is it a right of the people to defend themselves in the form of a militia? So is the right to guns a means to an end or an end in itself? But the interesting point for me at this stage is it comes right after religion. And somehow in the mind of categorizing, it's there. And right, but look at it, look how it's connected to religion. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service. What does that mean? That if you're a Quaker, then you cannot be compelled to bear arms. So with a right to do something, also perhaps comes an obligation to do something. And if you say you have a right to bear arms, then you have an obligation to bear them also. And Quakers will not bear arms, or that's one of their claims. And then where do we go? No soldier in time of peace. Now I maybe just have my mind running overtime, but I just find it curious that you list certain rights, religious rights, and then you mention right to bear arms, then you excuse those who don't want to carry arms, and then you go into the war. No soldier in time of peace shall be quartered. I don't know how to unravel it, but it would be odd of me to simply stand without stopping. And I've stopped, but I don't have the answer. But one of the origins seem to be 1689, Protestants have the right to bear arms. And once you come across the pond, then it's not just Protestants, it's Americans to defend themselves, but against whom or against what? Or is this just, I have to have that right because it makes me feel more secure. That's it. So what's it to you, Mr. Madison? Give it to me. I'll feel better. I feel better about it. So will that mean that you will support the Constitution if that's there? Yes. Okay.
Isn't that interesting? Can I just say that
Please.
8, 9, and 10 together, it is interesting. I've never seen that before in the way you put it here. And it really looks like 8, 9, and 10 are dealing with, for example, anti-Federalist fears of the standing army.
Yes.
Right? And
Yes.
danger of the standing army, which would have been a danger in the minds of British Protestants in 1689. James II, the Catholic monarch who had been deposed, and that danger. But it's also interesting to me that number 9 just points out, obviously relating directly to Quakers, no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms should be compelled to render military service in person. It's also interesting that if you go back up there, Sean, to the full and equal rights of conscience, number 3, nor shall those rights be in any manner abridged or pretext. Number 9 then says no person scrupulously, religiously scrupulous bearing arms should be compelled to render service. I wonder, just again, thinking out loud as you were suggesting, is number 9, does number 3, the full and equal rights of conscience, that does not mean to grant a religious exception for Quakers. That Madison thought you had to have number 9 in addition to that.
I would think that's a very fascinating and defensible interpretation.
Okay, interesting. Right.
or reinforce, yeah, and but it comes within the spirit of the right of conscience.
Yes, so it could be just a reinforcing example of number
Could
3,
be.
or it could be in addition to number 3, because number 3 doesn't include that. Right.
That is correct. And then we get into the question of how implicit could we be, do we have to mention everything?
Right.
What is the Constitution supposed to do? How do we look at this language? How do we read one part with another? We now know why it's in Article 1, Section 9, because it comes after Article 1, Section 8.
Yeah.
In other words, we list the powers, and now we list the non-powers. And then, let's continue. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution is a statement about what states can't do. And Madison here is very, very, this to me is one of the fascinating parts. Madison proposes that in Article 1, Section 10, between clauses 1 and 2, be it sort of this: no state shall violate 1, the equal rights of conscience, 2, or the freedom of press, or 3, the trial of... So if you were to ask Madison, I think, what are the 3 top rights? Conscience, press, jury. Jury comes from where? Magna Carta, the colonial here. Where does freedom of the press come from? The colonial, late colonial, and early state American tradition. Where does the right of conscience really come from? State constitutions. And it's very American and not British. And so Madison is saying, if we're going to restrain the federal government, what have we done now? Have we given up restraining the state governments? So we should also restrain the federal. Interesting. This is the way in which the doctrine of incorporation in the 20th century has been used to incorporate principles of the federal constitution into the state constitutions. Okay. We could go on, but I think you get the picture. He wanted it incorporated. If we go back to the story, Sean, please, and we go down, then, so what happens to this? It gets sent to a House Select Committee. You could read that. The House approves. So the main point to this part, let me just tell you what it is. Roger Sherman, who's always been Madison's nemesis, says, I don't want the work of the framers to be touched. They are sacrosanct. And can't you see Madison saying, but I am the framer? And I want the document opened up and everything put in. And Sherman wins. Not for the first time, not for the last time. Sherman wins. And so what happens? All the very, very hard work that Madison does to say, put this here, put this here, put this here. Somebody, we don't know who, but some clerk probably, sits down and plucks them out in that order. Plucks them out in that order. And then the House and the Senate argue, and they argue, drop the Declaration of Independence. That's the work of the previous framers. Don't touch it. Don't do anything to the preamble. And so what happens is that we now have 17 amendments separated from what Madison wanted. What becomes the first amendment? Census. 1 for 30,000. Why? Because that's how Madison began. What becomes the second amendment? Compensation. Why? Because that comes second. What becomes the third amendment? Religion. Why? Because that is how Madison started it. So somebody, unthinking, nothing to do with history, nothing to do with philosophy, plucks Madison's very careful work out and lists them as 17 amendments. Sherman wins. So it comes at the end, rather than at the beginning or in the middle. And then it goes to the Senate. And guess what the Senate does? The Senate drops, because it's the way the states are, drops the 3 restrictions that Madison put in against the states. So we get down to 12. And those 12 go to the states for ratification. And we end up with 10. 2 get defeated or don't get the appropriate number. And they are the compensation clause and the census clause. And in that process, I think we could do one more. Let's see, just go back. If you were to do the 4 stages, do the 4 stages, and this is where we're going to end. 4 stages. See, there's a various columns here. Let's just look down. Okay, these are the 17 amendments passed by the United States. So Article the 1st is the census. Article the 1st is the census in the Senate. Okay. Since the Senate and the House disagreed, they have to have a conference committee, just like today. A conference committee to iron out the differences. Guess who's on the conference committee? Madison. So this is the first. If you scroll down to number 3. As it comes out of the House, Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That is very Madison. And the rights, nor shall the rights of conscience be infringed. Conscience is in there. That's very Madisonian. What does the Senate do to it? No law establishing articles of faith or a mode of worship or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Conscience is dropped. I don't know why. The Senate doesn't have records. Does it make a difference? I think so, but I'm more than willing to talk about it. It's the Senate that adds to the religion clauses freedom of speech, the press, peaceable assembly, and petition. So one way you get down from 17 to 12 is that you collapse a few of them. So if someone were to ask you, where does that connection, those 6 together, who came up with that? The answer is the Senate. The House considered them to be separate. So did Madison. So as you can see here, freedom of speech, the press, etc., is considered to be separate. And here comes the 5th in the original. A well-regulated militia, says Madison, composed of the body of the people, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no one religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service. So there you can see the connection again between the right to bear arms and religious scruples. Again, saying that. Article 4, according to the Senate, drops religious scruples. Again, I don't know why. Does it make a difference? I don't know. I think so. If we were to go up, this then is what So you've got the House version, the Senate version. I focus simply on the religion clauses and with a little twist on the arms. So what did the House and the Senate finally agree to? 12. Okay. Did they do anything? Please, yes, that's it. Did they do anything to the religion clause? Yes. That would be number 3. Thank you. I would agree. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So it's in the conference committee, of which both Sherman and Madison are members, that we get the establishment of religion clause. This only comes right at the end of the entire discussion. I don't know what they're trying to fine-tune here. The Congress shall make no respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging right of speech. Conscience has disappeared explicitly. I don't mean to say it's explicitly disappeared. I mean it's disappeared in a sense that you have to read conscience back in, and you can read it given the history and the discussion. But I don't know what it is. All right. So then we get the Constitution. I mean the Bill of Rights. I'm going to end on that note, which is a note which suggests that I've taken you on a journey, partially rehearsed because I've prepared, and partly rehearsed because I've asked Sean to highlight 2 or 3 things. But I have no idea when I started where we're going with this. I hope we can still continue that. By origins, I mean the history and the philosophy. By politics, I mean the art of compromise and the art of simply grunt and where's the wind going. I think you have to put both together in order to understand how the language of the First Amendment became that language. Could it have been otherwise? Could the language have turned out to be different? Yes. What to me is the most glaring omission? The right to conscience. Does that mean it's not there? No, it doesn't mean that. But you have to read it into free exercise. Well, wasn't free exercise and the right to conscience there at one time? Yes. Does it make a difference? Is that not just superfluous? I don't know. So part of a journey is, what's the next one? Question time.
So many questions that I have. But just one to start with, I guess, and goes back to almost your last comment, really. What to make, two things strike me. First of all, you're right, the language could have turned out differently. That's so important for us to remember because we're so used to seeing, and this class and these students will be reading the Supreme Court opinions on that text. And the Supreme Court does not read them in the judicious way that you suggest. They read them as though the language could never have been any different.
Yes, that's
right. So, if the language could have been different, is the suggestion that you're making then is that what's really important, the language of course is important, but what's really important is to see the changes here, is to keep in mind the underlying principles that would have animated these particular words, and would have been in the minds of those at the time who were debating and deliberating on these words. Because those principles can be expressed in words with different words, but we could be talking about the same principle.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think my short answer is yes. And in this, if we go to the politics of the first Congress, debates in the first Congress, there you are. Shown number 2, that's it, 5 dimensions of development. And we go all the way down to the end. Well, not quite that end. Senate Journal. We have the House reports. The Senate did not keep a journal because it was secret. That is, the House decided, only later, and I don't know when, the Senate only later on decided to keep open journals. Okay. So here's all we have officially from the Senate. Senate, September the 3rd, resumed consideration, and they did so. On a motion to amend Article 3, that's the religion article at that time. And to strike out these words, strike these out, religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and insert one religious sect or society in preference to others. That means, so what the Senate is suggesting at this time, or certain members of the Senate said, what we really want is no one religious sect or society shall be given preference, which is an argument which is used today as an interpretation. And it was negative. So it's not there. Does the negative mean that's not what the framers meant when they had that clause, otherwise they could have. On a motion for reconsideration, it passed in the affirmative. On motion to adopt the following in lieu of the Congress shall not make any law infringing the rights of conscience or establishing any religious sect or society. So the right of conscience gets put back in as a motion. It passed in the negative. We don't know why. Upon the question, as it came from the House, it passed in the negative. On motion to adopt the 3rd article, nor shall the rights of conscience be infringed. So some senators said, we want the right of conscience explicitly in there. It passed in the affirmative. All right, so now what happened to it? It gets back in. The procedures of it on articles and on Article 3 to amend. Congress shall make no law establishing articles of faith or mode of worship or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or it gets dropped. It gets dropped again. It passed in the affirmative. Message from Beckley, we're done. If you look at the Senate record, the only recording that they have is dotting the I's, crossing the T's, changing the message on religion. And I would hope, I haven't done the work, but I would hope it'd be fascinating for somebody to look at Macaulay's diary or look at people who were there in the Senate, see their letters, and see whether or not there are any explanations out there concerning why these things happen. And unfortunately, there is no extensive, or as far as I know, extant existing record which would help us. So all we're left with is there's a word change here, there's a phrase change here, and we're left guessing.
Yeah, and we're left guessing why we have so little left from them, but so much of that so little is on religion. And there could have been so many other topics that they could have.
You've got exactly the point I'm making. Of all the Constitution they could talk about, of all the things that they could record, it's religion that they record and talk about and go back and forth. Virtually everything else is minimal.
Can I just, you're sparking so many ideas in my head, which is exactly what a presentation like this should do, right? But let me just throw this out to you and tell me what you think. The Senate is the place of the states, especially at that time.
Yes.
The states, as we were just talking about in class today, at the time of the founding, have really varied understandings of church-state relations, from totally disestablished in a place like Virginia to very established in a place like Connecticut. And they have different kinds of establishments and different understandings. It's quite a spectrum of possibilities. Is it possible that this occasioned so much discussion because the states had so many different church-state establishments and relations, and so many perhaps different understandings of religious freedom, that this was one issue on which they just couldn't come to much agreement, and they had to think it through because it would affect so much of their state?
I think that, again, like your first question, that's a very sensible and defensible answer. And it is true. So, for example, one play on that is that when Madison wanted to say, all right, Jefferson, when you say the people should expect any government to have a Bill of Rights, are you serious that the state government should also have a Bill of Rights? And are you serious about conscience and jury and press? Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to include those three so that we have, not only that the states are not able to do titles of nobility, the nation can't do titles of nobility. So we got both. What I also want, says Madison, if we're going into this right stuff, I want the states not to be able to do conscience as well as the nation. I want etc. And I think it's defeated in part because the right of conscience is very difficult to define. If you've got a Quaker state, you've got this state, this state, this state. And that is, so it's left with Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about no state shall make a law. And Madison's attempt to have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights say no state was defeated. So that the states were left open. Next question, of course, is to what extent does the Constitution and the Bill of Rights become a model over the next 40 years for the state governments? Do the states gradually shift towards falling in line with the federal government in the next 40 to 50 years, or do they keep their own identity with regard to religion and other matters? And that again asks the question, well, what's the Constitution supposed to do? Particularly when you have attachments to former colonies and states, etc., and you're trying to forge a union. And the union that you forge under the Articles you're deemed to be inadequate. So how do you forge a stronger union? How far can you go? And what is a constitution of that new union able to do? And of course you get the 10th Amendment, which says those powers not delegated to the Congress are reserved to the people of the states. That is, the future shall decide. That's how I read that. Unfortunately, there are a number of historians and political scientists that are very prone to suggest that through the art of compromise, you kick the can down the road. which means you don't deal with the question, you don't solve the question, you kick it and let the next generation solve it. And that's particularly prominent in the coverage by historians and political scientists on slavery in the Constitution. They kicked it down the road.
As opposed to the art of compromise that you were talking about, which would be the compromise would set the principle, but let prudence in practice work the principle out over time.
That's correct.
Rather than having compromise not establish any coherent principle.
That is correct. There's a sort of compromise which is a deal, say, that gets you out of a messy situation, but it is not trying to move the argument forward. It really doesn't care much about the argument. So for Washington, he doesn't mind whether it's one for 40,000 or one for 30,000. He's established the principle of representation. And whether it's one for 40,000 or one for 30,000 really is not critical once you've established representation. Now, I would have to say that if Washington were confronted with what about one for 600,000? I think you're stretching the principle to a little bit. Yeah. So I think, so somewhere in there, you can, in the end, Madison wanted these rights to be incorporated in the Constitution. If I may help Madison out a little bit, which he doesn't need any help at all, but it helps me to help him. It is that I think what Madison wanted to avoid, in my own language, were having two constitutional law classes, one dealing with powers and the other one dealing with rights, as if there's a massive conflict between the Constitution as it came out of Philadelphia and the amended Constitution of the First Congress and the court. And the amended Constitution belongs to the courts, and the original Constitution now belongs to the President. And the Congress is goodbye.
Yeah, right.
And so one way to avoid that problem, says you're putting it in my language, one way to avoid that problem is you incorporate it. You don't create that notion that there is a conflict. So you're going to have to work out how do you deal with powers and rights. Not a question of how do you deal with powers, the next semester we'll deal with rights.
When you put the language together, you see there's sort of two sides of the same coin.
That is correct. That's why it's Article 1, Section 8, and Article 1, Section 9.
It's extremely helpful. Well, thank you so much for coming today, prompting our thoughts.
Well, good. I hope